The morning I checked my charging station's usage log and found 41 sessions I had not initiated across 14 days. I was standing in my garage in the specific stillness of someone who has just seen a number that confirmed something they suspected but had not yet proven. 41 sessions. 11 distinct vehicles based on the connector engagement signatures my system logged automatically. 11 vehicles that were not mine, charging on my equipment, on my electricity, on my dime, because someone in Pinehurst Crossing had decided that my private EV charging installation was a community amenity and had apparently been telling people so for the better part of 2 weeks. My name is Joel Farris. I am 46 years old, a licensed electrical engineer with 19 years of experience in power systems design and residential and commercial electrical infrastructure, and I have lived in the Pinehurst Crossing HOA development in central North Carolina for 5 years. My wife Sandra works in pharmaceutical research. Our house is a 4-bedroom contemporary on a corner lot with a 3-car garage in which I had installed, 14 months before the situation I am about to describe, a level 2 EV charging station on a dedicated 40-amp circuit that I had designed and permitted and wired myself. The installation served 2 vehicles, my own electric sedan and Sandra's plug-in hybrid, and had been planned from the day we bought the house because we had known we were moving to EVs, and I had roughed in the conduit during a garage renovation 2 years prior specifically to make the eventual installation clean and correct. Charging station was a dual-port network unit, which means it connected to my home network and logged every charging session with a timestamp, a duration, an energy delivery figure in kilowatt hours, and a connector identifier that allowed me to distinguish between the 2 ports. I had chosen this unit specifically because the data logging capability matched my professional instinct for documentation, and because I am an electrical engineer and I do not install systems I cannot monitor. The station was on my property, inside my garage, connected to my electrical panel, and billed to my utility account. There was no ambiguity about any of these facts. Pinehurst Crossing had 62 homes and an HOA that was managed with reasonable competence by a company called Crestview Property Management, whose on-site coordinator was a woman named Renata Bloom, who I had found consistently professional over 5 years of routine interactions. The development had a small common area with a picnic pavilion and a dog run, but no community electrical infrastructure of any kind. There was no community EV charging. There were no shared electrical outlets in the common area or the guest parking lot. The development had been built in 2014 before EV infrastructure was a standard community amenity consideration, and the HOA had not subsequently invested in adding it, a topic that had come up twice at board meetings in the past 3 years and both times been tabled due to cost. The board president for the past 2 years was a woman named Gail Thorne, who was 60 years old, a former marketing director from Atlanta who had moved to Pinehurst Crossing 4 years ago and who had run for the board in her 2nd year with the organized energy of someone who had been developing her platform since her 1st month in the development. Gail had genuine enthusiasm for community improvement and genuine blind spots about the difference between community assets and individual homeowners' private property, a distinction that had caused friction in smaller ways before the EV charging situation escalated it into something larger. I had installed the charging station without fanfare. I pulled the permit through the county, passed inspection, and had been using it without incident for 14 months. I had mentioned it at a neighborhood gathering once when someone asked about EVs, describing the installation process and the permit requirements, and had noted that the network unit allowed me to track usage and electricity costs precisely. I had not described it as available to anyone. I had described it as mine. Gail had been at that gathering. I know this because I can place her in the conversation. She had asked 3 questions about the installation that I had answered directly. She had seemed interested in the community EV charging question generally and had mentioned that she thought Pinehurst Crossing should pursue a community charging installation in the guest parking lot. I had agreed that it would be a good community amenity and that I could help with the technical specifications if the board decided to pursue it. That conversation had apparently been processed by Gail in a way that I had not intended and would not have endorsed. I discovered the extent of the situation on a Tuesday morning when I reviewed the previous 2 weeks of charging logs as part of my routine monthly review of utility usage. The 41 sessions were spread across 14 days, occurring at various hours, with energy delivery totaling 312 kilowatt-hours. At my current utility rate, that was $41.60 of electricity I had not consented to provide. Dollar figure was not the point. The point was that 41 times someone had connected a vehicle to my charging station without my knowledge or permission, and that this had been happening systematically enough that it was clearly not accidental individual occurrences. The 11 distinct vehicles established that multiple people were involved. The distribution of sessions across different times of day established that this was being treated as an available service rather than an opportunistic one-time use. I pulled the garage security camera footage for the same 14-day period. The camera covered the garage interior from a corner mount and had been installed when I did the garage renovation. The footage showed vehicles I did not recognize pulling into my garage, connecting to the charging station, sitting for varying durations, and leaving. The garage door had a code entry system, and the code had been the same since we moved in. I changed it when I was 30 minutes into the camera review because the evidence made clear the code had been shared. I reviewed the footage systematically. I documented every incident with the timestamp, the vehicle description, and the duration. I cross-referenced with the charging logs. 11 vehicles, 41 sessions, 14 days, my garage, my equipment, my electricity. I called Sandra at her office. I described what I had found. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Who gave them the code?" I said, "I do not know yet, but I am going to find out." She said, "Call the attorney first." I called Daniel Webb, a property rights attorney in the county seat who I had used for a contract review 2 years ago and retained for ongoing matters since. I described the situation. He said, "Do you have documentation of all sessions?" I said, "Timestamped logs from the network unit for every session and security camera footage for every incident." He said, "Do you have any idea who is coordinating this?" I said, "Not yet, but the pattern is too consistent for it to be self-organizing. Someone told multiple people the charging station was available, gave them the access code, and established a pattern of use that has been running for 2 weeks." He said, "When you find out who, call me before you confront anyone. This is potentially a civil matter for the electricity cost and potentially a criminal matter for unauthorized access to your property and your electrical system. Document everything before you move." I documented everything. The full log export from the charging system, the security camera footage edited into a time-stamped compilation, the utility bill with the affected billing period highlighted. I put it all in a folder, and then I started making calls. The first call was to Renata Bloom at Crestview. I described what I had found and asked if the HOA had any knowledge of a community EV charging arrangement at my property. Renata said she did not, and that no such arrangement had been authorized by the board, and that no board action had created any right of community access to any homeowner's private electrical infrastructure. She said she would note the inquiry and asked me to keep her informed. The second call was to my immediate neighbor on the north side, a man named Frank Osei, who was an architect and who had an electric vehicle and who I had spoken with occasionally about the EV infrastructure situation in the development. I asked him if he had heard anything about community EV charging at my property. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Gail mentioned at the last block gathering that the Faris installation was being opened up for community use, while the board worked on the permanent solution for the guest lot." I said, "When did she say this?" He said, 2 weeks ago Saturday. 2 weeks ago Saturday was the day before the first unauthorized session appeared in my log. I said, "I did not authorize that, and it is not accurate." He said, "I did not use it, I was not comfortable with it, and I did not think it sounded right, but several people apparently did." I said, do you know who? He named 4 households he had heard discussing it. I added them to my documentation. The third call was to Phil Alderman, a board member I had known for 3 years and who I trusted to be direct. I described the situation and asked if the board had taken any action authorizing community access to my charging station. Phil said he had no knowledge of any such authorization and that no board vote had occurred on this topic, and that if Gail had represented otherwise, she had done so without board authority. I said, is it possible she believed she had authority to make this representation? Phil said the board president does not have unilateral authority to designate private homeowner property as community resources. That would require a board vote and a homeowner agreement. Neither occurred. I said, I need a written statement from you confirming that. He said, I will email it today. His email arrived that afternoon. I forwarded it to Daniel. Daniel called me after receiving it. He said, you have a board member confirming in writing that no authorization existed. You have a neighbor witness who heard Gail make the representation 2 weeks ago Saturday. You have 41 sessions in the charging log and camera footage of the vehicles. You have the electricity cost documented. This is a clear picture. How do you want to proceed? I said, I want to speak to Gail directly before filing anything. I want her to hear from me that I know what happened and I want to document her response. Daniel said, your call. Do it somewhere you can record the conversation. Virginia is a 2-party consent state. I said, North Carolina. He said, 1-party consent. You can record without notifying her. I set up a meeting with Gail the following day under the pretext of discussing the community EV charging proposal I had mentioned at the neighborhood gathering. She arrived at my door at 11 in the morning with a tablet and what appeared to be prepared notes, the energy of someone who had been looking forward to a productive conversation. I invited her in. I offered coffee. She accepted. We sat at my kitchen table. I had my phone recording in my shirt pocket. I said, Gail, before we discuss the community proposal, I want to ask you about something. I have been reviewing my charging station logs, and I found 41 sessions over the past 14 days from vehicles I do not own. She looked at me. She did not look surprised. She looked like someone who had been expecting this conversation and had prepared for it. She said, I wanted to talk to you about that. I may have gotten ahead of myself a little. I said, tell me what happened. She said, at the block gathering 2 weeks ago, I mentioned that you had a charging station and that you had offered to help with the community charging question, and I think people may have interpreted that as meaning the station was available for community use. I said, did you tell people the station was available for community use? She said, I thought we could work something out. I said, did you give people my garage door code? A pause. She said, I mentioned the code in the context of saying you were very open about the installation and had shared it with me. I said, when did I share the code with you? Another pause. Longer. She said, I thought you had mentioned it at the gathering where we discussed the installation. I said, I did not mention the code at that gathering. I described the installation process. I did not give you or anyone else the access code. She said, I may be misremembering. I said, Gail, my garage camera shows 11 vehicles I do not recognize using my charging station 41 times over 14 days. My charging logs document 312 kilowatt-hours of electricity I did not authorize. I have a statement from Phil Alderman confirming that no board vote authorized community access to my charging station. I have a witness who heard you tell people at the block gathering 2 weeks ago that the station was being opened for community use. She set down her coffee. She said, I was trying to solve a community problem. I said, you solved it with my property and my electricity without asking me. She said, I intended to bring it to you formally. I thought a short interim period would be fine. I said it was not fine. My property is not available for community use without my explicit agreement. My electricity is not a community resource. The code to my garage is private information, and sharing it without my authorization is not something you had the right to do regardless of your intentions. She said, I understand you are upset. I said, I am not upset, I am clear, these are facts. What happens next depends on how you choose to respond to them. She said, what do you want? I said, full reimbursement of the electricity cost, $41.60, which I will waive if you send a written communication to every household you told about this arrangement stating explicitly that my charging station is private, was never authorized for community use, and is not available. I want that communication sent today. I want a copy. I want a formal written apology from you to me acknowledging what happened. And I want a board vote at the next meeting formally confirming that no community charging arrangement exists at my property. She said, that seems like a lot. I said, the alternative is that I file the civil claim I have already prepared, and we address this in court. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I will send the communication today. I said, send me a copy before you send it to anyone else. She left without finishing her coffee. I called Daniel and described the conversation and told him I had it on recording. He said, that is very useful. Let me know if she follows through. She sent the retraction communication to 16 households that evening. I received a copy before it went out as I had requested. The communication said that she had made an error at the recent block gathering in suggesting that the Faris charging station was available for community use, that this had never been authorized by the homeowner, and that anyone who had used the station should be aware that doing so had been unauthorized and that the station was private property. It asked residents to disregard her prior representation. It was direct and it was accurate, and I noted both of these things. The written apology arrived the following morning by hand delivery, a sealed envelope in my mailbox. It was 2 paragraphs. It acknowledged that she had represented my property as available without my authorization, that she had shared my access code without my permission, and that she was sorry for the impact on my property and for the presumption involved in making decisions about my resources without consulting me. The second paragraph said she hoped we could continue to work together on the community charging proposal through the proper process. I read it twice and put it in the documentation folder. The board meeting 2 weeks later included the formal agenda item I had requested through Phil. The board voted unanimously to record in the official minutes that the Faris property at 14 Pinehurst Lane contained no community-authorized EV charging installation and that no community access rights existed to any private homeowner's electrical infrastructure without a formal homeowner agreement and board authorization. The vote was 5-0. Gail voted yes. I attended the meeting and said nothing during the vote because there was nothing I needed to say. The record was what mattered, and the record was correct. After the vote, I presented the proposal I had been developing. A community EV charging installation in the guest parking lot, 4 level 2 charging stations on a dedicated circuit with network management that would allow the HOA to track usage and bill residents at a per session rate that would cover electricity costs and eventually recover the installation cost. I had prepared a full technical specification, 3 equipment options at different price points, a permitting timeline, and a projected payback period at various usage assumptions. The board reviewed the proposal for 20 minutes. Phil asked 3 technical questions. Sandra Yee, who was not the same Sandra from prior stories, asked about maintenance costs. Renata Bloom noted that the proposal was consistent with the community improvement framework the board had discussed. Gail said nothing during the discussion. When the board chair asked if there were any other comments before the vote, she said, I want to note that this proposal reflects exactly what I was trying to accomplish, and I think Joel's approach is the right way to do it. I looked at her across the table. I said, thank you. The proposal passed 4-1. The one opposing vote was a board member named Craig Hobbs, who had opposed every capital expenditure proposal in his 3 years on the board on principle, and whose no vote was expected and had been factored into the planning. Installation happened 6 weeks later. I managed the project personally, pulled the permit, and oversaw the electrical work, which was performed by a licensed electrical contractor I had worked with on commercial projects. The installation came in under budget by $1,200, which the board noted approvingly. The 4 stations went live on a Thursday in October. Within the first month, 11 households had signed up for the per-session billing arrangement. By month 3, the usage rate was covering electricity costs with a small surplus that was going into the payback fund. Frank Osai was the second household to sign up. He called me when the stations went live and said, "This is what the community needed." I said, "It is what the community needed done correctly." He said, "Yes, that is what I meant." I changed my garage door code the day I discovered the unauthorized sessions and had not shared it with anyone since. The charging station in my garage served my 2 vehicles on my electricity on my schedule, and the usage logs showed nothing but my own sessions, clean and documented, and exactly as they should be. The community stations in the guest lot served 62 households on a transparent billing structure with full HOA oversight and proper authorization, and the usage logs showed steady growth and a system working correctly. Both things were true simultaneously. My private installation was private. The community installation was community. The distinction was not complicated. It had never been complicated. It required only that one person in the situation understand it clearly and be willing to say so plainly until the record reflected it accurately. I had been willing, the record reflected it, the stations were running. That was the correct outcome, and it had been the correct outcome from the beginning. Thumbnail text: she gave 11 strangers his garage code. His charging logs exposed everything.